Welcome to the Economic and Political History Podcast, where we discuss the latest ideas on the intersection of economics, political science, and history. Everyone, welcome to a new episode of the Economic and Political History Podcast. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University, and today I have the great pleasure of being with Luis Schenoni. Luis is Associate Professor and the Director of the Security Studies Program in the Department of Political Science at University College London. And he's the author of Bringing War Back In, Victory, Defeat, and the State in the 19th Century Latin America, a book published recently by Cambridge University Press. I'm very excited of having Luis here. Luis, how are you?
Doing well, Javier. Thank you so much for having me. A great fan of the podcast.
No, thanks for being here. And let me start our conversation with a question about your life and your career. I know you grew up in Argentina. You began your career there. Then you moved to the US. You were in Notre Dame, which by the way is where you are today. But you work in the UK, and so I want to hear about that path. But also I'm curious about your experience navigating this different academic environment. So I would like to hear if you struggle in a sort of translation process of the culture of each of these places. Tell me a bit about that, please.
Yeah. Well, as you said, I'm originally from Argentina. I only left Argentina to study abroad when I was 24, 25 years old, so relatively late. My instruction was mostly at Universidad Católica Argentina and then Universidad Torcuato Di Tella in Buenos Aires. But always looking up to people like Guillermo O'Donnell and other Argentines that were obsessed a bit with this issue of the state. I think, in a way, the fact that this book has come out so many years after, and specifically trying to explain the variation in state capacity and the state in Latin America, had to do with those early obsessions with this particular topic. And yeah, in a way, the reason why I applied to Notre Dame was also the intention of working with people working on these issues. I tackle, as we will probably see later, the issue of state formation in Latin America from an IR kind of perspective in this book. That is something that is not very common in Latin America to have people doing political science in the US beyond comparative politics and engaging fully with IR. That's something perhaps odd about my career. I was always more interested in these international dimensions of these processes. And therefore, for a while, I wrote about foreign policy analysis and international security. That's why my position in London is about security studies, international security. Um, so that's perhaps yeah, a rare feature of my career. Anyways, I ended up in the US. I did my PhD here. It was a great place to study this particular topic for different reasons. The Kellogg Institute offered a lot of support, and then I ended up, as you mentioned, in the UK, with this position at UCL. But before that, I was in Germany as well for 3 years and at the University of Constance, in Baden-Württemberg, southern Germany. Um, what I would say is all of these academic experiences have been really enriching, and of course there are challenges to jumping from one academic environment to the next. But you always see the world from a different perspective when you interact, from with academics from these places, and when you are embedded in this culture. So the US sees Europe in a very different way, in which the Europeans see themselves and their history and the relevant literature for understanding, for example, the processes that we will cover here. So yeah, I'd say challenging, doable, and I recommend to people to try to have these experiences of engaging in different diverse academic environments.
Tell me more about this thing that you describe as a weird feature of your career, this focus on IR. What was the origin of it? Was this related to a professor you had, experience that you had, what drove you to IR and not to what I agree with you, like a more conventional comparative politics like approach.
Yeah, I think in Latin America we have like an old tradition of international relations that goes back to some cohorts at Yale University at the times where Juan Linz was kind of teaching there. And one main kind of mentor that I had in Argentina was a professor called Carlos Escudé, who became like a really prominent theorist, higher theorist in the 1990s in Argentina and across Latin America. I think he inspired like this interest in the discipline itself, but at the same time, I started feeling that there was lacking in the discipline was lacking in method in comparison to how comparative politics was evolving in the 1990s and then in the 2000s when I was basically doing my degree and therefore, I always try to straddle the two worlds. My interest in the big questions of IR and this big international dynamics, and then how to bridge that with the methodological sophistication that comparative politics was acquiring and developing, while at the same time, oddly enough, in my mind or my interpretation, narrowing the questions that the discipline was asking, right? So it was leaving behind the big questions for the methodological sophistication. So one of the features of this book, hopefully people will find that they try to bring these two things together, a big question and a big answer, but at the same time trying to look at the mechanisms and identifying causal effects in a way that modern comparative political science and political economy tries to do.
I agree with you. So why don't we get precisely into that? So the first thing that I want to ask you about the book as a way of getting to the mindset of it is to hear from you what the Bellicist theory of state formation is. So for someone who does not come from or has no background in political science, what's that? How should we think about that theory and why it's important?
Well, basically, this is the theory that explains the origin of the states. So the state, as in different disciplines, and for example, economics, we see it more as a provider of public goods that otherwise wouldn't be provided because of the and a collective action problem. In political science or in sociology, perhaps we see it from a Bavarian perspective as this agency that monopolizes the claim to, or but has the claim to the monopoly of violence over specific territories. This is definitely like a fundamental kind of concept in political science. We cannot really study regimes or democracy or basically anything we do in political science without understanding what the state is and where it comes from. So the regime type, for example, is the rules by which is within a state the rulers are chosen basically the rules of the game of the political game within a state. So the state is at the core of everything we do in political science, and this is the theory that basically explains where states come from, and it is a theory that has very strong grounding in anthropology, in history, in comparative historical sociology or sociology, in political science, in economics. People from ranging from Douglas North to many historians, Arnold Toynbee, I don't know, to Max Weber, to in every discipline, people have thought of the origins of the state as related to war. And here the story is really simple, and it applies to the ancient states of Mesopotamia and the modern national states of Europe, is that essentially these coercive institutions that the state are, these bureaucracies, actually grow and legitimize themselves fundamentally when they have to protect society from an external threat, essentially. Um, and it is a pattern in history that, for example, the military and the state bureaucracies, they grow in contexts when they are threatened, in particular by other states or other similar political units, like in the case of city-states, and by virtue of what sociologists often call the extraction coercion cycle, which is that they have to build a large army to protect the societies from the external threat. To do that, they have to tax. To tax, they have to develop a fiscal bureaucracy. And in the course of developing this extraction from the population, both by a conscription and tribute. Also, many times the states suffer like revolts and basically against this advancement of the state over society, and that leads, of course, to the development of certain coercive capacity of the state as well to enforce those rules, that rule of law, right? That has to do with the development of judicial and policing capacities, etc. So in a an iteration of this kind of cycle of war, making the state and the state making war, as the famous sociologist Charles Tilly put it, is that we ended up after the total wars of the 20th century with the states that we now know in the United States and in Europe and East Asia is yeah, very strong states of today, and that's essentially kind of the main theory that we have across the social sciences and humanities to explain where these political structures come from.
Let me ask you about an additional mechanism that, well, you describe in the book quite well, that it's part of how war can generate this the states, right? So I mean, you mentioned extensively the expansion of armies and bureaucracies, right? But you also argue that there's this sort of additional mechanism that maybe it's somewhat mechanic related to the disappearance of those entities that don't have well the strength enough to survive, right? So, and I'm asking you because that will take us to something that is very important for you, which is the post-war period, right? So why don't you tell me about what's the logic of that mechanism, right? So what's this sort of survival narrative?
Well, in interpreting European history in particular, because this theory has been developed mostly by looking at the history of modern Europe, in particular in the last, let's say, 1,000 years, in a famous book by Charles Tilly called Capital Coercion and States in Europe from the year 990 to 1990. Is an example of that, long history. So people have thought of the different mechanisms by which war might have made a state. And one thing that happens often in Europe is that the Prussias, let's say, of Europe, or France is in particular, they end up swallowing smaller peripheral states like Bavaria or whatever it might be, Baden-Württemberg, or that historically Swabia or Burgundy. All of this end up being killed by a stronger expanding state. That is one mechanism that has been theorized in a way that perhaps war makes states by killing weak political entities that are not as efficient in war making as states. But I think that's only part and a rather, let's say, not so important part of the logic of Bellicist theory, because this happened in particular in Europe, where states were clustered in a very small kind of territorial space with a high population density, and therefore this killing of state happened a lot in Europe. But in other places, like Latin America, war still makes the states, even in the absence of the weaker states, dying. And this, I think, is by virtue of what I think is a correct interpretation of Bellicist theory, or the core, let's say, of Bellicist theory, which is this kind of preparation of war mechanisms that I described before. The fact that states have to mobilize and to fight the wars themselves and to fight off potential foreign threats, they have to build this capacity. But also the effects of the outcome of the war in legitimizing or not this war effort in the longer term. So I guess this selection mechanism that you mentioned could be brought in to explain part of what happened in Europe. But Bellicist theory, in a way, or what I call in the book classical Bellicist theory, going back to Max Weber, Otto Hintze, like the people that started thinking about these more in depth in the beginning of the 20th century, has other and perhaps more important elements to it.
Let's emphasize then that, right? So what exactly is what you understand as the elements that are missing in this conventional Bellicist theory? And what are exactly the dimensions in which you reinterpret it, and what's like the theory that comes out from your book?
Yeah. So, as I was saying, so the people that worked on this theory in the past, let's say 50 years in empirical, like comparative political sociology or comparative historical sociology or historical or historical political economy, they have been looking mostly at the European space and the dynamics in Europe. And only recently there is this problem literature looking at these dynamics in the global south and other regions rather than Europe. One big issue that the study of Europe has, I think, and this is also if people know Charles Tilly and his scholarship, he has this major 1975 edited volume and then his 1990 book that I mentioned. He always complained, he was very aware, even if a qualitative scholar, that his sample was biased, and it was biased towards the winners because he could only see the Englands, the Germanys, the Frances, which are the survivors and the winners of all of these historical processes. So one thing that has been less theorized, I think, until this book, has been basically the effects, the state building effects or state weakening effects of the war outcomes themselves. I think the correct interpretation of Bellicist theory would not look at these selection mechanisms as something central. It can happen that some states get killed, and that's worth analyzing as well. But basically, that wars make state in two moments. Let's say the first moment is the moment of preparation for war. I think this is the good representation of this classical Bellicist theory of this classical sociologists. Preparation for war, where you get extraction and coercion, you build armies, you tax the population, everything I described before. And then a post-war period where essentially the coalitions that are powered during the war, the coalitions that enforced taxation, that conscripted the armies themselves, are either legitimized by victory and consolidating in the long term after the war outcome is revealed, basically, or they are unraveled by the defeat. And then you cannot tax anymore because this is not legitimate for the population, and the army has to shrink in size, and you get it in a situation of what we might call state weakening. So this theory, as I put it here, this is what I call the classical Bellicist theory. Again, trying to represent the thought of Max Weber and these other scholars more completely. Again, it's not emphasizing this other aspect of the out selection of weak states as much. And that is a theory that I think can travel, basically can explain what happened to Europe, because essentially this might be the underlying reason why these states ultimately disappear. Like the Bavarians might have been extremely weakened in their legitimacy to the point that they accepted joining the German Empire, right? But also is a theory that can travel much better, can explain Latin American, that's the main argument of the book, Latin American variation in state capacity and therefore development. So this explains to me the reason why Uruguay, Costa Rica, Chile have high state capacity, why, Paraguay, Peru, Bolivia have low state capacity and low development therefore. But also I think can explain much of the world where states don't die, and in particular the post-World War II world where states definitely don't die anymore.
I want to ask you now about the mechanisms in your theory, right? So you talk about external and internal mechanisms, right? So being internal, those related to this coalition formation, institutional transformations, and external, like deeper territorial changes and things like that, right? So, so tell me more about those mechanisms and in which of those, and this is a way of like getting into the history of Latin America, which of those matter the most in Latin America? How do you think about that?
Well, I mean, here the main contribution of the book is about essentially the effects of the war outcomes, I would say. So there, and then the mechanisms that relate to that specifically, right? So the how the war outcome is connects with state capacity. There is a whole section of the book, chapter 4, that looks at the mechanisms of basically war making. So this is trying to engage a whole literature. We might come back to this later, but that argues that in Latin America, wars were financed by external resources and therefore didn't lead to mobilization or the type of extraction coercion that builds states. And there's something to be discussed about these mechanisms of war preparation, let's say, a mobilization for war, and how that leads to incipient state building or the creation of state institutions during the war effort. Um, but I will focus here in this answer perhaps in the two main mechanisms that I think I've are to me the most important in explaining why the victory leads, so in terms of the war outcome, why the victory leads to the consolidation of the trajectory of state building that happens during the war, and why defeat is so fundamentally weakening for the state. And this both kind of relate to legitimacy. And I think the first important one is, as I mentioned, the legitimacy of the military, essentially. So what we see systematically in Latin America, but I think this is generalizable, is that during the wars, you had, of course, a swelling of the size of the armed forces. And this allows for the state to impose its authority over what I call in the book peripheral elites. Peripheral elites are, for example, in the history of Latin America and other parts of the world, they have a claim to the monopoly of violence, let's say, over their own territories. And in the history of 19th century Latin America, sometimes they run their own militias and stuff like that. What happened during these wars is that usually the central government, uh, so the federal government, let's say, or national government, would essentially abolish these militias, centralize a lot of power, the numbers of the national army would swell, and then if victory followed, this new kind of institutional arrangement, status quo, would consolidate. The armed forces would become a big player in national politics, stabilizing this what before the war might have been a situation of constant civil wars between these militias of these provinces of this land of this kind of warlords or caudillos as we call it, by consolidating the professional national army. And I think that is one main mechanism, the most intuitive perhaps as well, because it has to do directly with who wields power, violence. The other is the consolidation of these coalitions that are in power during the war. That not necessarily relates specifically with the military. Again, I theorize that they are like central and peripheral elites. Central elites are basically those that are state building, and the peripheral elites are those that benefit from a weak central state because they want to retain their privileges in their own, patrimonial, usually, subnational region, subnational, feuds, right? And what happens here is that during the war, there is often kind of a coalition kind of cabinet. Like there is these two elites are brought together because they have stakes in defending, their themselves from an external enemy. That central elites basically get the upper hand. The state forming policies get the upper hand. But the peripheral elites are either kind of portrayed as traitors to the national cause or incorporated into this war coalition. And what tends to happen after victory is that these new coalitions, they, well, coalesce, but they stick together in the longer term. The peripheral elites kind of buy into this national project. Again, those peripheral elites that didn't jump on the bandwagon of the central elites of the war effort are portrayed as enemies to the war effort, and they're excluded, and a new equilibrium kind of takes place, or that is this what I call in the context of the book this national parties basically. This would be the Liberal Party of Benito Juárez or the Partido Autonomista Nacional in Argentina. You could think of this as generalizable to other wars in other countries as well, where similar dynamics tend to happen. And you can imagine how on the other side, if you suffer this defeat, but in the case of both mechanisms, the military will be reduced in size and social status and legitimacy. They would be like going back to the provincial militias usually. And also, in the case of defeat, usually the central elites were completely legitimized and the peripheral elites gained the upper hand in the post-war period. So I think those are the two main mechanisms by which, let's say, the war outcomes determine uh, the trajectory of these countries in the long term after they are rebuilt.
What do you think that, well, not yours exactly, but in general, because it's a general I guess position. The Bellicist theory has been generally disregarded for Latin America. I mean, you already mentioned something, right? So a specific perception that wars were financed with external resources. But what else is there, right? So why for decades scholars have felt that that works for Europe, but not really for Latin America?
Yeah. Well, since I started working on this project, I've been in touch with Miguel Centeno, a professor of sociology at Princeton University, very influential in these discussions because he was basically a student of Charles Tilly himself and the first to write a very influential book called Blood and Debt, 2020, 2002, but also previously in American Journal of Sociology article of 1997 about how this theory applies to Latin America. And he has in that article a great insight, which is to say that in Latin America, we have relatively weaker states if in comparison to Europe and the United States and East Asia, because we didn't have as much war, but in particular because we didn't fight the big wars that led to the big states that we see today, World War I and World War II, these total wars of the 20th century. And then he mentioned something about, the fact that, when we had wars, we had, we financed them through, loans and other additional stuff. But I think his big insight was, and which is absolutely correct, no wars in the 20th century, no state formation in Latin America in the 20th century. I think people took that after Centeno in the 2000s, 2010s as meaning that the states in Latin America were not made by war, but were made by some other sort of mechanisms, and they have come up with different theories of where the Latin American states might come from. Um, but what is interesting is that all of these books, in particular the last 10 years, they have focused specifically on the 19th century to find an explanation for that. Because we know that state capacity in the 20th century has basically frozen in Latin America. We haven't had made much progress. All of the development of our state bureaucracies and taxation systems, all of that, and basically traces back to period before World War II, and in particular to the late 19th century, which we call the period of state formation in our history lessons in Latin America and whatnot. So I think it's fundamentally this misinterpretation of the great initial kick-off kind of work of Centeno that started the debate. People took it all took the wrong turn basically after that intervention. I think the correct turn would have been to ask, okay, no war in the 20th century, but war in the 19th century. Does it explain all of the variation in state capacity that we see across the region? And I think this book, that's why the title "Bringing War Back In," with playing with bringing the state back in, which is a Theda Skocpol edited volume that very famous of the 1980s. Basically, what I'm trying to do with this is bringing war back in because this has, and hopefully you were persuaded, a lot to say when it comes to explaining variation in state capacity in Latin America. So I think that was the main reason probably why people have been missing this important explanation.
Tell me more about the scale and the frequency of wars in Latin America, right? So it's true that the 20th century seemed of not being, well, it was clearly not involved in this large scale uh, global conflicts. But in general, you seem to describe a scenario where war was much more prevalent and large than what probably was previously thought in the literature. So I want to hear that. So I want to hear about the figures and the magnitudes, and I also want to hear about why you think that we felt that wars were not as prevalent and large as you suggest they were.
Well, first of all, I think it's pretty evident that we had a lot of war and very big and frequent wars in the 19th century simply by counting them. So there's a table in the book where I count like 17 wars in Latin America. Wars, by the way, in IR, in political science, we consider confrontation between two or more states. So these are interstate wars that lead to 1,000 battle deaths. So it's a big event in terms of the amount of violence that is inflicting on this state by each other. And so while in Europe, between the Napoleonic Wars and World War One, you see 10 wars, depending on how you count. In Latin America, you see 17, uh, and producing more or less in total numbers the same kind of battle deaths. And you can see in Latin America, for example, there are examples of wars that are of the magnitude of the biggest European war. So the Paraguayan War between Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay against Paraguay produced more or less the same deaths, battle deaths, casualties, war-related deaths than the Crimean War in Europe around the same time, a few years before. Uh, Now, the biggest difference I think between Latin America and Europe is what these magnitudes of violence represented in per capita terms. And I think that explains a lot of why people have been missing this, because these wars in Latin America ended up like killing in the battlefield around 2% of the population of the region, an average of the 19th century. While the Europeans' wars ended up killing much less, like 0.3 or something like that percent. There are huge events of violence that were definitely state building that I think had gone unnoticed because these countries had a very small population, so people didn't really reflect on how violent and how what a degree of the mobilization of society this represented. In cases like, for example, the filibuster war in Costa Rica, which was fighting off like an invasion of a filibuster, William Walker, in 1856. 10% of the population of Costa Rica died during that conflict. So there was a population, of course, of 100,000 people. And well, when in the history books you see that 10,000 people die, well, in comparison to some Mexican civil wars, that is not so much. And but if you really pay attention to these episodes and what that war, for example, meant for Costa Rica, or what the 10-year siege of Montevideo meant for Uruguay, leading to similar, percentages of mobilization of the population to the army. These were incredibly big warlike experiences, and in terms of the mobilization of society, it looks like the worst times in European history. To give you an idea, for the siege of Montevideo, for example, which was basically Argentine troops and the Paraguayan opposition party besieged the city of Montevideo that was in a way uh, protected by and provided by sea by the French and British kind of liberal allies. So this lasted 10 years, and 10% of the population of Montevideo was conscripted into the army. And we know that the largest army ever assembled in the 19th and in history and until World War One was this Grande Armée of Napoleon that went into Russia, into Moscow in 1812, and that represented 2% of the French population, right? So the Uruguayans were mobilizing 10% of the population into the army at that time. So I think it might be a bit of that, I mean, not reflecting on the size of this experience, and but also yeah, maybe it's just sheer ignorance about these processes because of certain biases of I don't know, the certain intellectual traditions that had pushed people to think more about economic factors and others rather than war. Because if you read the historians, there is a wealth of literature about how war made the state. in the 19th century in Latin America, and that people haven't tapped into. Just to mention one, the biggest, perhaps the best historian of Latin America that Argentina has produced, and one of our best historians that was at UC Berkeley, Tulio Alperindongui. One of his best most books was about the militarization of the River Plate during in particular, the Buenos Aires Society during the Wars of Independence, where basically 50% of the male population was conscripted into the army of El Ejército de los Andes, basically, or to fight the Spaniards when we were fighting for our independence. So it's very clear that we did at a very high degree of militarization in the 19th century because of all of these threats. First, the European kind of immediate post-colonial threats, and French and Spanish takeovers of ports and the Brits and whatnot, but also this several wars against each other.
That's very interesting. I mean, honestly, that's one of the things that surprised me the most while reading your book, feeling that yeah, that we had this idea of rather Pacific in terms at least in of interstate relations region and being aware that if anything in per capita terms, it's dramatically violent. So yeah, I'm pretty curious about that. I would really love to have a better explanation of what at what point we sort of forgot that we had that very violent past. But let me ask you now, and this is a way of trying to connect your work with modern concerns on state capacity in Latin America. So how do you think and here I'm asking you something not very fair, but how to translate your like the lessons of the consolidation of a strong state in historical terms to something somewhat practical nowadays. So what can we learn from this the war made the state and the state made the wars in today's context, right? In particular in an environment where interstate wars are becoming increasingly likely again, right? So how should we think about that? And is there any aim and usefulness in reflecting on this mechanism today?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I think, of course, this book looks a bit more historical. Perhaps it will end up in the historical sections of the bookstores, kind of. But I do think is what's going on here is more like generalizable social science, and um, I'm working at the moment in some projects that look at, for example, what the effects of victory or defeat in Ukraine can be, for example, for the future of the Ukrainian state, the legitimacy, not just of the Zelensky and the Putin government, that's pretty obvious, comes to mind, but also the legitimacy of the Russian military and levels of taxation and conscription that have been imposed on the population because of this. For example, just take that one example. It would be silly to think that if Europe or the United States would stop helping Ukraine, and Ukraine was forced to be defeated in this war, that you could build like a strong, as sometimes it's called, like porcupine state there that will then by arming it, kind of deter Russian aggression in the future, because basically you would have a delegitimized, coalition that fought this war, delegitimized armed forces, and on the other side of the border, you would have not just the Putin regime strengthened, but also its state fundamentally, right, independently of whether it's him or his successor or whatever that takes over, right? The same, I think, applies to under the understanding of Israel and the Middle East and to today, right? The progressive strengthening of Israel in the context of the region after all of its different rounds of militarization and victories, right? Israel is kind of a serial victor in the Middle East. It has a very highly mobilized, highly legitimized state in front of, in particular, its own population with really high levels of conscription and et cetera, right? So I think that this theory is important to understand the world of today. I think this is in in the praise that was offered by Jim Robinson, our mutual friend, for the book. He mentions that very clearly. It's like, is this not it's not just persuasive as an explanation for state weakness in Latin America and variation in state capacity in Latin America, but also has really huge implications for understanding the world in which we live today. And it's also in the praise by Miguel Centeno. I think people have made that have read the book, sociologists, economists, others, have really identified this. I think you're right in pointing out that this is it. These are dynamics that we thought were not around anymore after World War II. And if one were to analyze these dynamics in the 1990s, perhaps they wouldn't have much application to their real life. But now you can see it all over. You can see it in the strengthening of the Chinese state by mobilizing this rivalry against the United States, and um, so yeah, I think this is a theory that is worth bringing back in as well in when it comes to interpreting geopolitical dynamics that are on the forefront of the news, really. Yeah.
Let me ask you now a couple of questions beyond the book that I mean, you're a fantastic person to address them, I think. So the first one is about what you think are the promising areas to explore in the history of international relations of Latin America. So, what are those episodes, periods, contexts that you're particularly interested in that you think that we haven't paid enough attention in the history of the international relations of the region? And then the second question is about how you perceive the field of international relations in Latin America. As you mentioned, I agree that it's not exactly the strongest field in political science in the region. Are you optimistic? Do you think that it's gaining attention from younger generations? Do you see any particular challenges facing? I want to hear your thoughts on these.
Yeah, those are great questions. I mean, in terms of issues in the history of international relations in Latin America that are worth exploring, I think overall, perhaps because of what you mentioned, the relative underdevelopment of this discipline, there are lots of great questions in IR that we can address. This is definitely one of them. So, but then you can also, for example, look at the origins of nationalism as in relation to these conflicts. For example, famously, this is another project I'm working on, but famously, um, Benedict Anderson in this Imagine Communities, he mentions that Latin Americans, we kind of invented nationalism because we all spoke the same language, we all had the same religions, we all more or less our elites looked the same. They had to come up with basically the modern nationalism of the flag and the anthem, which was of course taken from a bit from the French in the French Revolutionary Wars, etc. But we really gave it like the shape, let's say, that characterizes the ideology in our day. For so I think that is a big topic that should be it's in the purview of several disciplines, but IR people could tackle. The other big question that I'm also working on in a project with Gary Gertz and Paul Deal and Andy Osiak, some scholars of peace, in particular, in this peace science kind of side of IR, is why we stopped having wars at all in the 20th century. So why suddenly you have in the whole region, and the last war is the Chaco War in the 1930s, and then you don't have basically as measured by 1,000 battle deaths, for example, literally no more wars. I mean, not even the Falklands Wars reached that threshold, or the Malvinas, as that's what we call it in Argentina, war, has reached that threshold. So that's an impressive thing in the history of Latin American IR. I think people should really delve into those questions. Whether I see a future, let's say, in this discipline, and what are the patterns and in the development of the discipline that I can pick up today, and I can foresee in the future. Well, I uh, I think there is still a lot of let's say inward-looking kind of academic and kind of groups like that haven't quite engaged fully with the top IR scholarship that is produced um, globally, kind of, and that is a thing that perhaps where there's room for progress. I think comparativists have been much better in tapping into top global debates um, and yeah, definitely there's room for a lot of methodological improvement, but also for kind of theoretical updating. We still have these debates about realism and institutionalism and constructivism and this kind of schools. This is the way IR was taught, perhaps in the US in the 1990s, and this is still being taught a bit like this in Latin America. How the only way to make progress really is for scholars of IR in Latin America to apply to good schools all over the world and interact more with other academic communities to bring back a lot of the new stuff that is going around. Right? I hope this happened. But on the other hand, I think like many people in the other fields of political science can perhaps hopefully see that it's very important to think about the big international kind of aspects of these developments, right? So there's also that aspect of comparative politics that tends to be very domestic oriented and not very aware of the importance of, the big international explanations for things and big, and for example, this book, I think one of the things that it does that comparatives hadn't thought of doing before is leverages this correlates of war project from the University of Michigan that has been around for like 50 years and has all of this data about these wars and militarized disputes and blockades and all these things that happen in Latin America. So the data, going back to the question of why people miss this, it was there, only that the comparativists were thinking in their comparative kind of domestic politics way. And there's room for much more cross-fertilization there.
Luis, thank you very much. This was a fantastic conversation. Thanks for working on this book. Let me show it again for our audience. And let me also add to the already several praises that you've received. This was a book that changed in many ways the way in which I think about the region and its consolidation as modern societies and world state in particular. So thanks a lot. I appreciate also your time and kindness to have this conversation.
Thank you, Javier. I appreciate those words very much coming from you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for tuning in today to the Economic and Political History Podcast. Don't forget to stay connected with us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Javier Mejia C and connect with me on LinkedIn. You can find me as Javier Mejia Cubillos. Until next time, stay engaged, thank you, and take care.